I want to look at my evolution of shame. In my teens, I listened to the Lazarus channeling material about healing shame at different levels. And one of the things that I learned was from Lazarus was, for example, that one could transfer shame through behavior, and in particular, as a teenager at the time, and as a lot of the shame that is created in our culture is created in the relationship dynamic between children and teenagers and the education system, the family system, and the larger culture. And so the first thing to understand is that every human being needs love and belonging. And that love and belonging ties into survival and security of survival. Meaning that when you're living in a largely human-made environment, whether it's the buildings, the building codes, the laws, the automobiles, the gasoline station, the money system, when a great deal of one's life and consciousness is taking place within a cult framework where everyone agrees that this is the way to do things, that if you do not have love and belonging, your odds of survival go way down. If you do not have the blessing and goodwill of the human beings around you that are creating large segments of your environment with a tension between the individual and the group, which brings in the physics of mass. The physics of mass say that when 5 people gang up on 1 people, the group almost always wins because there's superior mass. You have an intelligent child, for example, that says, why do we have to learn algebra at school? 1, and why aren't I learning how to build a house at school? Well, there's immediately a cacophony of answers. Well, you have to learn algebra at school, and you can hire a builder to do that. It's like, but when have you used algebra? And, might you not have avoided some of the massive mortgage that you're in, etc., if you knew how to build a house? So I'd like to be learning this and not this. And the teachers say, well, tough, and the parents say, well, I don't have, just do what everyone else does. What you have is a conflict between intelligence and mass. And so the individual is very often more intelligent than the group, but in a social dynamic in which love and belonging are key to survival and security, you have this sense of, how does the individual survive when they are in an insane group that is much bigger than them? Because the law of mass is very simple. If you have a Mini Cooper driving into a semi-truck, there's no question about who's going to sustain the most injuries. It's a law of mass. It's not a law of intelligence. You see, because it doesn't matter if the semi-truck is driving on the wrong side of the road. If you're in the Mini Cooper driving in the perfectly correct side of the road, you're in your little Mini Cooper, you're doing the thing the way you're supposed to do it. And a semi-truck, drunk, is in your lane. If you do not move out of the way of the semi-truck, you will be dead. The semi-truck driver, not so much. Because if they plow into a phone pole, with the weight of a semi-truck behind, they just knock the phone pole over. If they plow into 3 Mini Coopers, they plow that out of the way. And this gives us a sense of the vulnerability of the relationship between an infant and parents, between children and the cult around them. That is saying, this is the way things are done here. And it's like, that's not me. That's not intelligent. I don't want that. I want this. But intelligence doesn't matter in a cult framework. Now, and the reasons for this are simple, because, for example, with an infant or a parent or in a teacher situation, the teacher can humiliate the individual who's more intelligent, and does so statistically speaking. Statistically speaking, individuals in an education system that encourage a more intelligent form of education will be targeted by their teachers. Why? Because it reveals the stupidity of the teacher. The fact that a teacher maybe knew all of those things too. It is crazy, and why am I doing this? But the teacher themselves, if they're a good teacher, has been in this one position against the education system. How many individual teachers hate the mediocrity of American education? A majority of excellent teachers, individuals, hate the mediocrity of American education and its protocols. But they are not a majority of teachers. A majority of good parents hate the mediocrity of parenting education and protocol and support in this cult. But they are not a majority of parents. And so you have this phenomena where the individual in a state of excellence and aspiration is always at odds with the majority of inertia and sustained momentum. Now, this is part of the evolutionary process. But what I want to talk about is what happens when you have a great idea as an individual, as a child, as an infant, for how things could go better, and you meet superior mass. Well, what happens is a conflict. And in the conflict, superior mass always dominates inferior mass. Larger bodies move smaller bodies out of the way with their momentum. And in the process, the best within the species is consistently and repeatedly harassed and dinged up and beaten up and humiliated into silence, into smallness, and into invisibility. There are all kinds of resources: the police, the military, withholding money when you're a minor, refusing to give a job to someone that would restructure the company, refusing to talk and invite someone to dinner who has perspectives that require the status quo to think. You get a nice status quo together of capitalist entrepreneurs, and they're all into, is it making 10x capital, and what's the best way to manipulate and corner the market, and this and that and the other. Well, you bring someone in there that wants to collaborate and wants to bring in the data that getting a 10-time return on investment is not likely to bring enough happiness in the investors relative to deepening and quality relationships where you get to participate in something exciting, innovative in the culture that actually, it doesn't just corner the market. It actually delivers high yields of personal well-being by the consumer, by the customer. Well, this individual isn't welcome, so they're just not invited to the money table of investing, and they're not invited to share their opinion of the group. Whereas the child, for example, that says, "Oh, mommy and daddy is a wonderful parent," they get called on when guests are there to describe what's great about the family, and the other person who has critical things to say about why did Uncle Harry rape my sister and stuff. Let's try and get them over at friend's house so that we can maintain the positive image of the status quo. Now, the status quo, or the cult nature of every culture, can be described as an asymmetrical structure inside the spherical probability field. So you have a spherical probability field that has enormous grace. You have the ideal form of grace and organization that is much more circular, much more feminine, much more ecological in its nature, and it's much more complex. It doesn't break people down into tribes, for example. It's much more nuanced. This is not an evil person and this is not a good person. This particular action of this person damages these things, and this particular action at the same time benefits these things. And so the question is more of symmetry in context, which is a much more sophisticated and complex conversation to understand and articulate. And it also often leads to integration and resolution, which doesn't support the rigid identities so many people feel safe holding on to. And so the cult is, by definition, a more limited and simplified and often asymmetrical structure that is imposed on that graceful probability field of possible interactions. Now, for example, in many of our cults, we've got a hierarchical framework. Now, this causes all kinds of problems, because what it says is if you're up here at the point, you've got high cult status. Now, the biggest point that we measure, if you want to look at lists, for example, is money. So if you're a son of a bitch with a depressive, volatile temper who terrifies people half the time in your presence, and you're able to manipulate with that tendency to be at the top of the Forbes 400 list, you are ranked high cult status in a cult that defines itself by its capital as defined by a capitalist cult or culture. So if you have lots of money, you're up at the pyramid. And generally what cults do is they define the best they can in their evolutionary process what they think is a good thing based on whatever instincts and limited knowledge they have available, and often based on their context. They then form something like capitalism, for example, as a structure. So within capitalism, everyone can be ranked based on how much money they have. And there are sub-rankings in there as well. The efficiency with which the money was produced, the level of risk at which your portfolio is invested, the diversification intelligence. Does it conform with current leading best-selling books, for example? For example, GE with Jack Welch, was doing quite well using Jack's method of leadership. And so the Jack Welch and the GE way, it was everywhere. And so if you wanted to be considered serious and someone that believed in that value, well, then you'd talk about how it was what Jack would have done and this and that. But now GE is falling on hard times, and it's admitted the weak points in the Jack Welch method. So now nobody wants to hear about the Jack Welch method. Now that it's led to problems with GE. So now we want the new method, which what's the new thing that's working? And so the high ranking and status is constantly changing, and it's always wrong, is an important thing to be aware of, because by the time that everyone's doing it or everyone believes it, it's usually wrong, because often in pendulum swings and in a simplified cult dynamic, we identify whole directions as good or bad. Bigger is always better, for example, is a great one. And so it's going to be bigger. Well, when you're very small, being a little bigger may be better. But when you're at that size, there's an optimal size. For example, in the Gore-Tex Corporation, they've found that if they develop teams bigger than at most 150 people, it's the dynamics of the group deteriorate. And so as Gore-Tex has grown into a multi-billion-dollar company, it has maintained this small group focus in its architecture, in its employee relationships and all that, to keep that module in size, because the human brain cannot maintain social interactions of an intimate nature with more than 150 people at most, tying into our biological heritage in tribes, which, the groups of whether they were Indians or this group or that group were typically groups of around 150 people, and sometimes 30, sometimes 40, sometimes 150. We just don't remember birthdays and have meaningful feelings of more than 150 people. But we've gone ahead and created cities where people feel completely dissociative. I don't know anyone, and it's like I'm surrounded by people, but there's not a single person I can trust. There's not a single person who knows me perfectly well. I'm invisible. Because it's out of sync with the actual biology of social connections in the human brain and in human capacity to remember and be intimate with. So it's like, well, that's fine. We're not paying attention to human biology. We're just designing for what? What are we designing? Well, bigger is better. Well, it doesn't seem to be. It doesn't seem. But now it's better. It's better. And so we get fixated on these little ideas that we then elevate beyond their point of competency. In the Peter principle of business, to promote someone to their level of incompetency, we take concepts and ideas as cults and cultures, and we promote them beyond the level of competency. And so, in that scenario, cults are a complete and utter failure at coming up with complex, symmetrical forms of grace, which means that there is always going to be a minority that is more intelligent than the cult as a majority. The minority is always going to be at the bleeding edge of progress, but the minority is going to be knocked by superior mass. It's a difficult dilemma. Now, incredibly intelligent cults, which we don't have, nurture their minorities and treat them like gold, because the minorities are always paving the way for the most brilliant future. The minorities. The minorities are also insane and delusional and all that. So you have to be able to have some intelligence as you select which minorities you deal with. But you want to deal with minority groups. If you want your family to grow, you want to hear what the black sheep has to say and knows about the family system that everyone else is burying and hiding, because the black sheep is revealing the energies that are suppressed and denied in the family system, and they are a minority. And so you actually want to hear. If you want to understand what's sick about the United States, talk to the prisoners. They know. But we don't want to know what's sick about our cult, because cults are particularly self-referential. Now, they're self-referential to maintain stability. The goal of stability is to protect us from trauma. The reality of every fear-based cult in history is that it is terrified of death, which it encounters in large energy masses in unfamiliar terrain. So the enemy is blanketed as the unknown, that which is not us. Of course, the ally is in the unknown. The greatest future and innovation is all in the unknown. But in fear-based cults, the unknown is generally categorized as the enemy, and the cult is heralded as a self-referential, self-sustaining loop of dogmatic status quo, specifically to create a level of normalcy and stability that means that people feel comfortable to leave their house because they're not facing the unknown. They know how traffic is going to behave in this and that and the other. And so that's the value is that cults provide, is an unintelligent norm that is maintained so that people know what to expect regardless of how disastrous that knowledge may be. I mean, is there any doubt whatsoever that when you turn on the news tonight, you will hear some fresh, horrific something or other? Well, there's no doubt at all. The news has been designed to produce adrenaline. There's always something going wrong, and the more graphic, the higher the adrenaline levels. the adrenaline is necessary to increase buying. And in capitalist frameworks of media, the definition of what gets put onto a screen is that which sells the most ads. And the most ads get sold right after a peak of adrenaline. And so hearing that there's a nice meadow out in the back of your city that's still nice and green doesn't produce any adrenaline. So that is not news. Hearing that 98% of people arrived safely to work today, that's not news. It doesn't produce adrenaline. What produces adrenaline is anomalous events. So it's by definition a very, very tiny minority of something horrible. And so that has been defined as the news. So you know with absolute certainty in your cult that if you turn on the news in a capitalist framework, you will hear horrible things. So, I need to hear something horrible. Let me turn on the news. You can depend on it. And so there's a certain certainty. Now, how does this tie in with shame? Well, shame is what is outside the terrain of culturally sanctioned behavior. Now, the phenomenon of shame is designed as a deterrent for the individual, regardless of how intelligent, for the individual who is about to encounter superior mass. And so in a dynamic where the group can always kill, starve, shame, marginalize, make sure they don't get promoted, the unruly and disruptive individual. The shame is the experience we feel when who we are is met with superior mass in a direct or subliminal message that says, you will not survive this encounter. You will not survive this encounter. And so the idea is the bowing of the head. I bow to superior mass. Now, when what is bowing, what is submitting, what is being surrendered to superior mass is our human needs, is our vitality, our need for a sense of repair after that traumatic event, our need to feel that we're valuable, when that is what is asked to be surrendered, the message is not only one of shame, like you better, you're not, it's a message that you don't matter. You don't matter. The feelings that you're identifying with must be sacrificed for the stability of the cult. Your feeling of needing tenderness in a chauvinistic cult doesn't matter. Meaning in a chauvinistic cult, men are ranked in part, as are women, by how unemotional they are, by how sociopathic they are. And in that sense, if you have a place of deep emotional need, you are low ranking within the chauvinistic framework. Because a chauvinist would make a little witty remark, everyone would titter about it, and the low-ranking person would go off humiliated, and isn't that funny? And the cult has been maintained. The dominant mass has sublimated another minority. Unprofessional behavior has been shamed and sent back to its desk, for example. So you have a dynamic of superior mass which is triggering a traumatic awareness that if you don't cooperate with your elimination, with your sublimation, with your sacrifice of what is good and beautiful and unique in you, you will not belong. If you don't belong, you cannot feel secure in your survival, because if you've created a cult that says we don't want those types of people around here, you go to get a job and the cult is in place. You're one of those people. We don't want you. But I can do the job faster and better. We don't care. You have black skin. You're a woman. You're a sensitive type. You wouldn't fit in with our jocular and chauvinistic vernacular. you're not a fit for our cult. You don't. Your breasts are not big enough to work at Hooters. You're not tall and dominating enough to present the banker persona. So we don't really want you here. If you're really good and stuff, we'll make a few exceptions, but just don't push it because you don't really belong here. You're tolerated. So your survival is not as strong in your framework of human needs because you're the first to be let go. You're the one to be made the fall guy. If someone makes a mistake, it's the low-ranking person that gets blamed. My secretary, the idiot. I don't want to take responsibility and look and lose face to you that I blew you off because, my secretary was blowing me in the office and that's why I was late. So having received my blowjob, let me communicate that I was on time, but my secretary, poor idiot, wrote the time wrong. And we'll both agree with that. Even if we don't believe it, you've got to take the fall guy because I'm part of a $1 billion acquisition. She's a replaceable secretary. Or he's a replaceable. And so we have these dynamics within, once we rank a cult into different areas of statuses, regardless of the underlying intelligence of that ranking, which has some intelligence, but it's never optimal. It's never optimal. Regardless of that, we're going to make the fall guy be, the person that everyone feels comfortable to be the fall guy, which is the low-ranking person. And so you have, and this is, whether it's The Devil Wears Prada, where you can kind of see these things where once you set these metrics in place, people often become very cutthroat, very sociopathic to maintain their position in the hierarchy because they're being valued, not for their humanity, not for their dignity, not for their grace. They're being valued for their ability to maintain superior mass to muscle out stuff. You have this in dictatorships where they kill off people that might threaten their position. And so, same in the family. If you have an intelligent, bright child that can think more than dad, well, dad doesn't like feeling small. Well, neither does the kid. But dad's got the money and the belt and the humiliation and the law. So who's going to win that one? The intelligence? Or if the father beats the shit out of that kid enough and the kid takes on the worthlessness of the father and says, I must be worthless because no one has come to my defense. No one has come to my defense. My mother didn't want to earn her own income, so she let my father beat me. My siblings didn't want to be beaten, so they let my father beat me. My teachers wanted the private school money, so they let my father beat me. The police didn't want to deal with anything uncomfortable and emotional. They're jocular and important because of their sociopathic ethic, right? They don't have feelings. They're the police. So they don't want to get into emotional grief and despair of a 7-year-old or something like that. So they just say, be a good kid and you don't deserve protection in our cult, regardless of your intelligence. So there's this beating down. A teacher can humiliate in front of the class and destroy the sense of belonging because, you see, if the class member is regularly laughed at by students who are afraid of being humiliated themselves, they lose all sense of belonging, which decimates their biology. Their biology goes into trauma because they're not sure they're going to survive in a cult that's going to be decimated. And so in that dynamic, there is an agreement to carry the shame of the cult at an individual level in the low-ranking members. And so you have a hierarchy. Every cult has its hierarchy. With women, it's usually something around the physical body is a big part of the hierarchy. And with capitalism, it's how much money you can make and how much money you can keep, regardless of how you do it. Just win. I mean, if you can break the law and win, you're golden. If you break the law and get caught, well, we don't want you. Because if you get caught, you lose money with lawyers, you make the image look bad, we just get rid of you. But if you're winning, oh, we want you. And so you have this whole dynamic. Now, every hierarchical cult has a really low status area and has a high status area. And the cult is self-referential. And so, for example, a cult that doesn't value mothers for raising children, if you raise a child, you are automatically low-ranking. Just that simple. And so every cult creates often a majority of people in a low-ranking position. And then, because cults like to feel good about themselves, no majority in the history of culture has ever said, we are wrong and we apologize to our minorities. Now, of course, they know they're wrong, but they've got the mass, and they like to feel good about themselves. And everyone else, particularly the people who are high-ranking, want to feel good about themselves. And so they don't say, this is a shit-faced system, and the statistics put you, being born in this neighborhood and being born this color and being given this education and given these jobs in this economy, the statistics are 85% against you. Meaning there is an 85% probability that you, in the cult that we've designed, are going to end up being low-ranking. And in a chauvinistic cult of superiority, better than, less than, that's actually going to be translated into human worth, where you're just not important enough to be treated with the same courtesy as the billionaire over here, or the person with the Rhodes Scholarship over here, etc., which is, of course, given, for the most part, for studying the things the cult is interested in, not human feelings and not psychology and not family relationship dynamics. No, we're not going to give you a Rhodes Scholarship for that. We're going to give you a scholarship for discovering a new subatomic particle. Wow, that's going to change reality for everyone on the planet. You now have a subatomic particle named after you. Now, reality happens just the way it did before, but you developed a subatomic particle theory. Now, if you could discover a technique for de-escalating anger, something that could save millions of childhoods and PTSDs for the entire planet, well, it's just not very interesting to this cult. This cult is materially obsessed. And so if you're not materially obsessed, we just don't give you the grant to study things, and you remain low-ranking and poor, and thus not very valuable, viewed through a capitalist lens. And so the message that is given by the majority is, you are not valuable. You are not worth it. You are not lovable. You are not desirable. That's the message given by the high-ranking aspect of the cult structure to the low-ranking aspect of the cult structure. That's the message given from the parent to the child. Yes, you may want me to stop my job and do this, but I don't care. I'm the parent. And so there's a message, you don't matter. That's the underlying message of shame. Now, the crisis of shame is, of course, that your biology knows you won't survive unless you are tolerated, at the very least, within your cult. So the question is, what do I have to do to be tolerated? Well, if you're a cute bimbo and you're studying parapsychology, fine, he's fucking you for your boobs, you've got them, you can keep them. And of course you're a bimbo, you're studying parapsychology, fine, isn't that cute, isn't that nice? Of course we know you're not very important, but you're at the table because of your husband or something of that nature. But of course, when you know that who you are and what you're discovering is actually more intelligent than the whole system within which you've been dominated, there is a sense of anger. And a healthy anger itself challenges the system, but you're in a minority position. And the majority tells you in varying degrees, you don't want to go down that road. Yes, I do want to go down that road. Well, you see, you're not going to win. And by the time you're not invited at all, by the time that you're homeless, you will have regretted not fitting in with the cult. And the message is, okay, I've got to fit in with the cult in order to survive. But I've got to break with my authentic self in order to fit in with the cult. So the shame is carried by the authentic self that every single part of the circle within the cult of that which is both created or allowed. You see, cults are created both by people actively enforcing and creating them, but they're also created by people allowing. For example, I live in one of the wealthiest counties in one of the wealthiest countries of the world, Marin County in the United States. Now, there are 2,000 to 3,000 homeless people, and then there are many more thousands that are right on the edge of being homeless in my county. And that is created and it is allowed by everyone in the county. It is allowed every time someone doesn't pick up the phone and say, do something, you fucking mayor. Call yourself a mayor, grow up and actually create some low-cost housing. Oh, we couldn't do that. Why? Well, our tax base might go down. We make the most money as the city by taxing percentage of housing. If people have low-cost housing, we're not going to make as much money. So then our status as city officials goes down because we're poorer. So we can't do it. We just can't do it. Well, we allow that. And so it's caused by what? You can't collect your own water. Why not? You just can't. You've got to buy it from us. You can't create your own power. Why? Well, you can't. You've got to buy it from us. You can't handle your own sewage. Why? Well, you just can't. You've got to buy it from us. Okay. You can't build a small house. Why? Well, the minimum square footage has been defined as 1,200 square feet. Minimum. Why? Well, we're not going to talk about that because we're the majority. And so we're just not going to deal with it. But I'm an artist in a cult that doesn't pay artists well. Is that the inadequacy of the artist, or is that the inadequacy of the cult? You see, the chauvinism of the cult says, I am more important if I have a 12,000 square foot home than if I have a 200 square foot home. Well, if you had 200 square foot homes, you could afford art because you're not, working 12-hour days for a 12,000 square foot mortgage. But no, we've got to have the mortgage because that's important. And we'll get around to art because that's not important. To who? You're going to walk your 12,000 square feet and just keep cleaning it? And how about some beauty? Yeah, well, that's not important in the cult. I won't get any perks. In fact, someone might laugh at me in this cult if I liked this kind of art versus that. And so then we create a cult in which artists are underpaid. Well, if we've also created a cult where it costs $600,000 as the lowest price with which anyone can build a legal home in this county, we have now created, on the one hand, a cult that doesn't pay artists well, on the other hand, a cult where artists are illegal if they're homeless, and on the other hand, a cult that says that they can't get into a house for less than $600,000. Well, that's a cult in which artists are homeless. And we create that and we allow each of the various regulations and value hierarchies in the cult by living them, by not protesting them, by not engaging with them. And so what is caused and what is allowed by the majority equals the statistics. Every cult is a design of various structures, legally, financially, emotionally, traditionally, etc. These are a series of meaningless memes in many ways that often don't stand on their own 2 feet for a moment. If you expose a cult to some fresh air, they fall down like a house of cards because they're insane. Cults are insane at every level. You talked, why can't I build a smaller house? It would be better for the environment, would save money, it would save water, it would save electricity, it would reduce the fire risk. Fire trucks could put it out easier. It would be faster construct, less neighborhood noise. It would be more ecological, better for the planet. Well, we don't care. You can't build a small house. Well, what about education? If I did this and this and this, it would be better. What about work? If we did work like this and this and this, it would be so much better. Well, you can't do it, you can't do it, you can't do it. What about traffic? That would work better if it was done like this and like this. What about electric cars? That would work better. And what about this? Well, you just can't do it. We don't want it. We don't want it. You know, if you look at the backlash against Tesla, what? An American car company creating jobs in America for one of the best consumer-rated cars ever, but they don't like it. You know, Ford pickups will sometimes block the charging stations and try and, where the diesel. What is it? You're changing the status quo with a more intelligent model, and we don't like it. And so we're going to try and drive you down. We're going to, have the investors gang up to try and short sell Tesla, and, the largest short sold stock on Wall Street. We're going to go on the news and say how it can't work. We're going to do everything possible, and it's like some poor schmuck works 100 hours a week to make it a reality, then we'll kind of grudgingly let them into the pack. And we've done that with races. The Irish used to be, way down at the bottom of the pecking order in New York, and they managed to stay alive and not think something of themselves and grow, and so now they're high ranking, but it's someone else, the Mexicans. We just love ranking people and dumping shit, because every crudely designed cult creates pain. It creates massive amounts of pain. Now the question is, who deals with the pain? Because up here it's usually pretty cushy in the cult. But who deals with pain is usually the majority. But the minority that's given authority because of their cult status, if you're rich, it's much easier to get elected, then you can create laws for rich people. It's a wonderful system for people that are high-ranking in financial intelligence. But it's not a good system for artists. And so the dynamic of shame is, first of all, the biology saying I can't win, I can't fight, this is hopeless. That's part of the biology of shame. Now, as soon as you know that, your brain starts shutting down, so you perform less. And then that becomes self-referential. See, they perform less, that's why they're losers. As opposed to, we didn't invite you to the table, and so you're carrying the shame of the cult, which is the inadequacy of the cult. The inadequacy of the cult gets passed to the most divergent minorities to carry the pain, which is the hatred of the cult towards change, because change always comes through the minorities. Always. The phone. At one point, the telephone was operated by one human being. Now, if that was attacked, it would, of course, not exist. But the phone is now everywhere. Why? Because that minority was invited, and it created change, positive and negative. It created change. So every change begins with the minority. That's why the most intelligent and sophisticated cults protect their minorities and give them an equal footage. That will be an evolving and an intelligent cult, relative to another cult that just kills off and executes any ideas of change, which is the danger of dictatorship and the superiority of democracy, of an informed democracy over dictatorship. Just on that metric alone, you can be beautiful dictatorships that really care about their people, but that doesn't tend to be the case. So shame is the adoption of the inadequacy of the cult by the individual as a condition to survive, knowing that if they start flaunting their style and their way of doing things, they will be unemployed and pushed out socially, financially from the systems. And so you have this dynamic of shame. The healthy process of healing shame is to give it back to the cult that gave it to you. There's nothing wrong with me being an emotional man or a highly emotional woman. There's something fucked up in a cult that has no place for the circle of probable human beings, that doesn't have the intelligence to design unique roles for highly emotional people, that instead sticks them in the same base jobs. We don't want highly emotional McDonald's flippers, but that's where you're going to go. We don't have intelligent pairing of unique traits with beneficial roles within the cult. We have very limited processes for even selecting employment. It's all supposed to be on money, not temperament, and all kinds of weird designs. So shame is a biological phenomena that ties in with our social need to belong, and the fact that every cult has a hierarchical ranking system, and that every cult is poorly designed, and that this is passed off onto the lowest ranking people. The lowest ranking people who carry the shame of the cult get sick, become depressed, don't perform as well, spend more time in hospital, don't fight for their rights as much. And the norm is sustained. And everyone who participates either causes that or allows it. Every parent that says we should help strangers when it's a nice, rich neighbor, but we shouldn't help strangers when they're homeless, is causing and allowing that system. Because if the child wants to get out and help the homeless person, we say, no, we don't talk to those type of people. You see, in our cult, if people have been harangued out of their homes, they then get socially shunned. And so if you don't make a lot of money and want to be an artist or something like that, you too will be shunned by everyone, just to discourage you from breaking with the status quo. So shame is ultimately a cultural disease produced by poor cultural design that is internalized by the lowest ranking people in the cult, who often have superior individuality and intelligence that is dominated by superior mass or the majority, and in doing so kills the future and life of the cult, leading cults to deteriorate. That's why there have been 10,000 cultures in human history, 10,000 languages to represent those cults, and they're almost all dead. Because when cults become too ossifying in their protective fear of the unknown, they must die to make room for the new, as opposed to transform and embrace the transcendence of renewal. This is my understanding of shame. My work with shame, in meditation, in these videos, for example, giving the shame back to the cult, giving the shame back to the parents, to the teachers, to the government, to the various majorities, to the clients, to the bosses, giving them back the shame. We have, as a cult, created and allowed a highly dysfunctional system that leaves 20% of Americans depressed, that leaves 1 in 7 Americans addicted, that leaves 50% of all domestic relationships containing aspects of domestic violence, that leads to repeated betrayal, failed marriages, intense degrees of infidelities, a lust addiction cycle as opposed to a love and healing cycle in many relationships with ourselves and with other, and a terror that if we don't climb high in the competitive ranking system of money, that we will be punished and considered worthless by a cult that doesn't know how to value human beings. And so we participate and we allow that to one degree or another, in part because if we pipe up before we have adequate mass ourselves, we are then ostracized very violently or very politely. We just don't invite you to the golf game where all the business deals get sorted out and suddenly you can't pay your rent and now we don't have to listen to you. You're just one of those vagrants on the street. So a little bit of thoughts about shame.